Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Have you ever had that feeling? That prickling on the back of your neck when you're taking out the trash at night? The unshakable sense that a window in the house next door isn't just dark, it's watching? We tell ourselves, it's just paranoia, a trick of the mind, that in our safe little neighborhoods, with our trimmed lawns and friendly wave-to-your-neighbor culture, real monsters don't exist. They're confined to movies and storybooks. But what if the monster isn't under the bed? What if it's just over the fence, watering its petunias at 7 a.m. sharp, taking its bins out on a Thursday evening, smiling just a little too widely when it sees you? This isn't a story about a ghost or a demon. This is a story about Mr. Evans, the man who lived next door. It's a story about how the most terrifying thing of all isn't the unknown. It's the known, twisted into something horribly, intimately wrong. This is a true story, and it forever shattered my illusion of safety. It all started when my wife, Sarah, and I moved into 42 Laurel Drive. It was our first house, a modest but beautiful semi-detached with a small garden. It was our little slice of the dream. The street was quiet, filled with young families and retired couples. It was, by all accounts, perfect. Our next-door neighbor, Mr. Evans, was the first to welcome us. He was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with a head of fine, well-combed white hair and clothes that were always neatly pressed. He was watering his rose bushes when we were hauling in a box. He gave us a small, polite wave. "New blood," he said, his voice a soft, reedy thing. "Welcome to Laurel Drive. I'm Arthur Evans." We introduced ourselves. He was charming, in an old-fashioned way. He told us the best place to get a Sunday roast, which days the garbage trucks came, and to watch for the Joneses' cat, who had a habit of using flower beds as a litter box. He seemed like a font of useful, benign information. "I've lived here for 40 years, he said, nodding at his own house. "Seen families come and go. It's a good street, quiet. You'll be happy here." He was right. For the first few months, we were blissfully happy. We'd see Mr. Evans often. He was always puttering in his garden, his movements precise and economical. He'd wave. We'd wave back. Sometimes we'd exchange a few words about the weather. He was the ideal neighbor, present but not intrusive, friendly but not overbearing. The first oddity was so small I almost forgot about it. I was leaving for work one morning, and as I got into my car, I saw Mr. Evans' living room curtain twitch. Just a slight, rapid movement, and then it was still. I thought nothing of it. Probably just a coincidence. The house was old. Maybe it was a draft. But then, it happened again. A few days later, Sarah was gardening in our front yard. I was inside, watching her from the window with a cup of coffee. I saw it again. The same curtain in Mr. Evans' house. A slight part, just enough for someone to peer through. It held for a second, then fell back into place. I mentioned it to Sarah that evening. She laughed it off. "Oh, he's just a lonely old man," she said. "Probably likes watching the comings and goings. It's harmless. I wanted to believe her, but the feeling it left me with was cold. It wasn't the curiosity of a lonely man. It felt like surveillance. But the small things began to stack up. I'd come home from work at slightly different times, and without fail, within 5 minutes of me pulling into the driveway, Mr. Evans would appear on his porch to fetch something. A newspaper, a package, to adjust a wind chime. He'd always offer that same polite wave. Evening, Mark. One Tuesday, I had a day off. I decided to surprise Sarah by fixing the squeaky garden gate. I'd been out there for about 20 minutes when Mr. Evans's back door opened, and he stepped out into his garden. He looked surprised to see me. "Day off?" he asked, his voice a little too casual. "Yeah, lucky me," I replied. "Everything all right? You're not normally here on a Tuesday." The statement hung in the air. It was true. I wasn't. But how did he know my schedule with such certainty? How did he know that me being home on a Tuesday was an anomaly? I just shrugged. Just felt like it. He nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on me for a moment too long before he turned to his compost bin. The interaction left me deeply unsettled. He wasn't just noticing me. He was tracking me. The final straw of the friendly phase happened with Sarah. She'd been feeling unwell with a migraine and had stayed home from work. She'd drawn the blinds in our bedroom and was trying to sleep it off. Around midday, the doorbell rang. She ignored it. It rang again, insistently. Wrapping her robe around herself, she went downstairs. It was Mr. Evans. He was holding a small container of homemade soup. "I saw you weren't feeling well," he said, his smile gentle. "I thought this might help." Sarah was touched, but also creeped out. She thanked him and took the soup. When she told me that evening, her face was pale. "Mark, how did he know?" "The blinds were closed. I didn't make a sound. I didn't tell anyone." "How did he know?" That was the moment the friendly neighbor mask began to crack. We stopped waving so eagerly. We started drawing our own curtains at night. The house next door, once just a part of the scenery, had become a monolith of silent observation. The game had changed. We just didn't know the rules yet. The polite facade began to erode, replaced by something far more brazen. It started with the notes. The first one was slipped under our door. It was written in a precise, elegant cursive on a small index card. "Your bin lid wasn't fully closed last night. I secured it for you. Wouldn't want raccoons making a mess." It was signed with his initials. It felt less like a helpful tip and more like a reprimand. A reminder that he was watching, even in the dead of night. The next note came a week later. "The lavender bush by your front door is looking a little dry. It requires watering in the early morning, not the evening." Sarah crumpled it up. "Who does he think he is?" she hissed. We were starting to feel like tenants in our own home, under the scrutiny of a live-in landlord we never agreed to. Then came the sounds. Our houses shared a wall, and it was old. Sound carried. We started to hear things, not loud noises, but small, intimate ones. The faint, rhythmic scrape of a chair being moved at 3 a.m., the low murmur of a television. But when we pressed our ears to the wall, it didn't sound like a program. It sounded like talking, muttering, a single, quiet voice, talking for hours on end. We began to double lock our doors. I bought a baseball bat and kept it by the bed. The stress was eating us alive. We were jumping at every creak, every rustle of the trees. We were prisoners of the house we'd once loved. The climax, the true moment of sheer, unadulterated terror, happened on a Friday night. Sarah was away visiting her sister for the weekend. I was alone in the house, feeling vulnerable and exposed. I'd had a couple of beers to calm my nerves and had fallen asleep on the couch in front of a movie. I was woken by a sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was coming from the back door. A soft, metallic scraping. My blood turned to ice. I was frozen on the couch, barely breathing, listening. The sound stopped. Silence. Maybe it was a branch? I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then it came again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. This wasn't a branch. This was intentional, deliberate. I slowly, silently, got up from the couch. I crept into the kitchen, my bare feet cold on the tile floor. The sound was clearer here. It was definitely at the door. I didn't turn on the light. I peered through the small window in the door, out into our pitch-dark garden. I saw nothing, just shadows. Scritch, scritch. The sound was right there, at the lock. Someone was trying to pick it. Adrenaline surged through me, burning away the fear, replacing it with a fierce, protective rage. This was my home. I grabbed the baseball bat from where it leaned against the wall. I took a deep breath, and in one swift motion, I flicked on the outside porch light and yanked the door open. Bat raised high. "Get the hell away from my..." The words died in my throat. The porch was empty. The light illuminated our small patio, the lawn, the fence. Nothing. No one. The gate was closed. It was utterly still. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? Then my eyes dropped to the doormat. Lying there, perfectly centered, was another white index card. My hand trembling, I bent down and picked it up. The same precise handwriting stared back at me. This time, it was just a single, simple sentence. A sentence that flooded me with a cold, soul-deep horror that I will never, ever forget. It read, "You really shouldn't sleep with the doors unlocked, Mark." He wasn't trying to break in. He was proving a point. He was showing me that my sanctuary was his playground, that my locks were meaningless, that he can be at my door, listening to me sleep, whenever he wanted. I stumbled back inside, slammed the door shut, and locked every lock, but I knew it was futile. I spent the rest of the night with every light in the house on, sitting with my back to a wall, the baseball bat across my knees, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. He didn't come in that night. He didn't need to. The damage was done. He had already gotten inside my head. We moved out 3 weeks later. We told the landlord it was for a job opportunity in another city. We didn't tell him about the notes, the sounds, the feeling of being hunted in our own home. We were afraid he wouldn't believe us, or worse, that he'd tell Mr. Evans. The day the moving truck came, Mr. Evans was in his garden, meticulously pruning a bush. He watched us load our lives into the truck with that same placid expression. He didn't offer to help. He didn't ask why we were leaving. As I was doing one final check of the empty house, I found one last note. It was tucked inside the kitchen cupboard, right where the coffee mugs had been. My stomach clenched as I opened it. "It's been a pleasure having you both next door. The new neighbors move in on the 15th. A lovely young couple, I'm told. Much like you were." We never went back. We bought a detached house with a large perimeter. We got a dog. We installed security cameras that ping our phones with every motion. But you can't install a camera on your psyche. You can't lock the door on a memory. I still jump at unexpected noises. I still catch myself analyzing the behavior of our new neighbors, looking for a sign, any sign, of that particular kind of attention. Was Mr. Evans a supernatural entity? A ghost? I don't think so. I think he was something perhaps more frightening. A human being, utterly devoid of boundaries, consumed by a quiet, terrifying obsession. A man who found his purpose not in living his own life, but in dissecting the lives of others. The world is full of empty, lonely people, and some of them fill that emptiness by watching. So, if you ever get that feeling, that prickling on the back of your neck, listen to it. Your instincts are the only security system that can't be fooled. And you never really know what's going on behind the neatly trimmed hedges of the house next door. You know that sound, right? The groan of old pipes, the creak of floorboards settling in the dead of night. When you live in an old apartment building, you learn the soundtrack of the place. It becomes white noise, a lullaby of urban life. But what happens when the soundtrack changes? When a new sound joins the orchestra? A sound that doesn't belong. A sound that's deliberate. I used to think the worst thing about city living was the noise from other people. The arguments through thin walls, the blaring TVs, the footsteps from the apartment above. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. The worst thing isn't the noise you can explain. It's the noise you can't. The scratching that starts and stops with a purpose. The whisper that isn't quite a voice. The feeling that the labyrinth of vents and crawl spaces behind your drywall isn't empty. That it's serving as a highway for something that doesn't pay rent, doesn't sleep, and is endlessly, intimately curious about the people living on the other side of the grates. This is the story of my last apartment, and the thing that lived in the walls. The building was called the Marlowe, a classic, pre-war brick monstrosity that had a certain crumbling charm. My studio apartment on the 4th floor was small, but it had high ceilings and a huge old-fashioned steel vent in the living room floor that pumped out heat like a dragon's breath in the winter. I loved it. It was my first place alone, a symbol of my independence. The first few months were perfect. I learned the building's rhythms. Mrs. Gable in 4B who played opera every Sunday morning. The guy in 5A who seemed to be building furniture at 2 a.m. It was loud, but it was life. It was normal. The change was so gradual, I almost missed it. It started during a bitter cold snap in January. The wind howled outside, and the ancient heating system kicked into overdrive, making the vents clang and shudder as they expanded. But one night, mixed in with the metallic groaning, was another sound. A faint, skittering scratch. Scritch, 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 scritch. I muted the TV. Mice, I said to myself, aloud. It was an old building. It was to be expected. Annoying, but not apocalyptic. I made a mental note to call the super, old Mr. Henderson in the morning. The next day I mentioned it to him in the lobby. He was a weary man in stained coveralls, perpetually smelling of cigarette smoke and bleach. Vents? He grunted, not even looking up from his clipboard. Probably mice, or rats. Put out some traps. They'll find their way in from the walls when it gets cold. Nothing to be done about it. His dismissal was reassuring in its mundanity. It was just pests. A fact of life. I bought a package of snap traps and baited them with peanut butter, sliding one near the floor vent. I went to bed that night feeling proactive, adult. I was woken at 3:17 a.m. by a sound that was not a skitter. It was a thump, a solid, dull impact against the metal deep inside the vent. It was followed by a long, slow, scraping drag, like something heavy was being pulled. My heart was in my throat. That was no mouse. Mice don't thump. I lay there in the dark, listening so hard my ears rang. Silence. Then the scratching started again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost patterned. Scratch, 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 scratch. It sounded like it was right under my bed, traveling through the vent from somewhere below. Apartment 3C. I didn't know who lived there. I'd never seen them. The next morning, I checked the trap by the vent. It was unsprung. The peanut butter was gone. Licked clean. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I told myself a mouse had been clever, had gotten the bait without setting it off. But the thump from the night before echoed in my memory. That was no mouse. The noises became a nightly ritual. The skittering, the scratching, the occasional unsettling thump. I stopped sleeping. I started wearing earplugs, but the vibrations seemed to travel through the floor into my bones. I became obsessed with the vent. I'd find myself staring at the dark, slotted grate, waiting for movement. One Tuesday, driven by a sleep-deprived mania, I got on my hands and knees, pried the rusty cover off the vent, and shone a flashlight into the duct. The beam illuminated a world of dust and darkness. The sheet metal tunnel dropped down about 3 feet before bending horizontally, disappearing into the wall. The dust on the bottom of the duct was thick and undisturbed, except for a single clear path down the center. It was as if something had been sliding through it, over and over, keeping a narrow trail pristine. And then, I saw them. At the very edge of the flashlight's beam, just before the duct turned, there were smudges. But they weren't random. They were patterns. Dozens of them, etched into the thin layer of dust on the metal walls. They looked like childish scribbles at first, but the more I stared, the more a pattern emerged. They were all variations of the same shape, a series of straight lines and sharp angles, like a starfish or a stick figure with too many limbs. My blood ran cold. Rats don't draw. Mice don't make patterns. I slammed the vent cover back on and scrambled away from it. I called Mr. Henderson again, my voice shaking. There's something in the vents. It's not rats. There are drawings. He sighed, a long, suffering sound. Kid, it's an old building. It's probably just pipes rubbing, making marks. Or some kids got into the crawl space years ago. Don't let your imagination run away with you. He refused to come up. I was alone with it. That night, the game changed. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the now familiar scritch, scritch, scratch. And then, it stopped. The silence was more frightening than the noise. It was a listening silence, and then a new sound began. It was a voice, but not quite. It was a whisper, so faint it was almost subliminal, filtering up through the floor vent. It was garbled, wet, like a radio tuned to static between stations. I couldn't make out words, only a low, rhythmic muttering. It was coming from below, from 3C. I felt a primal fear, the kind that bypasses your brain and seizes your spine. This wasn't an animal. This was something that could mimic, something intelligent. The whispering lasted for maybe a minute. Then it was replaced by a sound I will never forget. A low, guttural, clicking purr. It was a sound of contentment. It was the sound a predator makes when it's found its prey. The next day, I was a ghost. I couldn't work. I couldn't eat. The sun shone outside, but my apartment felt like a tomb. The vent in the floor was a black mouth, and I couldn't stop staring at it. The knowledge that something was down there, listening, learning, muttering to itself in the dark, had shattered my sanity. I had to know what was in 3C. I had to prove to myself I wasn't going insane. I waited until the afternoon, when the building was mostly empty, and I went downstairs. The hallway on the 3rd floor was identical to mine, but darker, danker. The door to 3C was at the end of the hall. It looked wrong. The peephole was scratched and clouded, as if it had been rubbed with sandpaper. The wood around the lock was splintered and scarred, not from a break-in, but from the inside, as if something had clawed at it for years. And the smell. A faint, sweet, rotten odor seeped from under the door. It was the smell of old meat and damp earth. My courage vanished. I couldn't knock. What would I say? "Hi, I'm your neighbor for upstairs. Are you a monster?" I turned to leave, and my foot kicked an empty milk bottle left by the door. It clattered against the wall. From inside the apartment, there was a sudden, violent silence. The faint humming I hadn't even registered until it stopped, ceased instantly. Then, a sound, a slow, dragging shuffle, coming toward the door. I stood frozen, paralyzed by terror. I heard a wet, snuffling sound at the base of the door, right where the smell was strongest. Something was sniffing the crack, scenting me. A shadow blocked the light from the clouded peephole. A voice spoke from the other side. It was the same whisper from the vent, but clearer now, horribly close. It was a dry, rasping parody of a human voice, each word an effort, as if learned by rote without understanding. "I can hear you breathing." I ran. I didn't care about dignity. I fled down the hall, up the stairs, and slammed my apartment door shut, locking every lock. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving. It knew I was there. It knew my scent. That night, I barricaded myself in my bedroom, pushing a dresser in front of the door. I had my phone in my hand, ready to call 911. But what would I say? My neighbor whispered to me. The sound started earlier than usual. The scratching was faster now, frantic. It was no longer coming from the floor vent. It was coming from the wall right behind my headboard. Scratch, 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 scratch. Then a loud bang against the wall, making the pictures rattle. I screamed and scrambled off the bed, pressing myself against the far wall. Silence. Then, the whispering started again, from the bedroom vent this time. It was louder, clearer. I could almost make out words, but they were nonsense, a chaotic jumble of syllables. It was followed by that same horrible clicking purr. And then, the most terrifying sound of all. A new sound. A soft, metallic click-clunk from the living room. I knew that sound. It was the sound of the floor vent cover being pushed aside from below. Something had come up. Something was in my apartment. I heard it. A slow, wet, dragging sound on my hardwood floor. Shh, thump. Shh, thump. It was moving from the living room into the short hallway that led to my bedroom. I was hyperventilating, tears streaming down my face. The dresser seemed like a pathetic defense. The thing stopped outside my bedroom door. The sweet, rotten smell seeped under it, filling the room. I heard that wet snuffling again, right at the crack under the door. Then a long, slow scrape, Something was dragging itself along the outside of the door. I could hear its weight, its mass. This was no small creature. It stopped directly in front of the door. The shadow under the door was completely blotted out. The voice spoke again. This time, it was soft, almost coaxing, a horrible imitation of warmth. "Let me in." It wasn't a question. It was a request, an invitation to a game I didn't want to play. "Let me in." I slid down the wall, clutching my phone, sobbing silently. I was going to die here, in my first apartment, behind a dresser. And then, a miracle. From the street outside, the blaring sound of a car alarm. A neighbor's SUV, triggered by who knows what. The effect on the thing outside my door was instantaneous. It let out a guttural hiss of pure rage. I heard it shuffle back, moving quickly now, its dragging gait retreating down the hall. I heard the soft, metallic scrape of the vent cover being moved back into place. Then, silence. I didn't move until the sun came up. I was out of that apartment by noon. I left everything. My furniture, my clothes, my security deposit. I told the landlord I had a family emergency and never came back. I moved across the city into a modern, high-rise building with sealed, central air conditioning. No vents, no crawl spaces. A month later, driven by a morbid need for closure, I looked up the local police blotter for my old address. I had to know. There was a small 2-line entry from a week after I'd left. Welfare check requested for resident of the Marlow, Apt 3C. Upon entry, apartment found in severe squalor. No sign of occupant. Foul odor noted. No further action. No sign of occupant. The thing was gone. Back into the walls, maybe, or into another dark, forgotten place in the city. I never found out what it was. A person suffering from extreme mental illness. Something else? Something older that had always lived in the bones of that building, peeking out through the cracks in reality. I don't know. And I don't want to know. All I know is that we like to think we own our homes. We pay the rent. We sign the leases. But we're just temporary tenants. There are older, deeper things that live in the spaces between the walls, in the dark above the drop ceiling, in the tunnels of the ventilation shafts. They were there long before us, and they'll be there long after we're gone. They watch, they listen, they learn, and sometimes they get hungry or lonely, and they decide to knock. So the next time you hear a scratch in the wall, don't just blame the mice. Listen closer. Is it random? Or is it a pattern? Is it a rhythm? Is it a language? And for God's sake, whatever you do, don't answer it. There's a certain kind of silence you only find in the country. It's not an empty silence, but a full one, filled with the buzz of insects, the sigh of the wind through endless fields, the distant lowing of cattle. It's a silence that feels ancient, permanent. We city folk romanticize it. We see it as an escape from the noise and the rush. We imagine a simpler, quieter life. But that silence can be a liar. It can hide things. Out there, where the houses are miles apart and the roads are long, dark ribbons under a huge, uncaring sky. There's no one to hear you scream. There's no police car just a few minutes away. There's just you, the corn, and the things that watch from the edges of the fields. The things that don't belong to the daylit world. This isn't a story about a person or a ghost or a monster in the classic sense. This is a story about the land itself and what happens when it decides to turn its gaze on you. This is what happened to me and my wife Sarah during one autumn in the countryside. It's the reason we sold our dream house after only 6 months. It's the reason I can't look at a field of corn without feeling a cold dread in my soul. This is the story of the scarecrow at Harlan Farm. It was supposed to be our fresh start. After a decade of the city's grind, the constant noise and light pollution, we used our entire savings to buy a small renovated farmhouse on 10 acres in the middle of nowhere. The property was bordered on 2 sides by vast, rolling fields owned by our only neighbor, a reclusive older man named Mr. Harlan. The house was perfect, quaint, charming, with a wraparound porch and a view that looked like a painting. On one side, our land gave way to a wild, overgrown wood. On the other, it met the edge of Harlan's cornfield. The corn was already high when we moved in late August, a towering green-gold wall that rustled with a sound like whispering secrets. The first time we met Mr. Harlan, he was as weathered and taciturn as the land itself. He arrived on an old, rumbling tractor, tipping his cap to Sarah. "Name's Harlan," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Welcome. Mind the fences. Cows get out sometimes." He gestured with a calloused thumb toward the woods, and best not to wander too far into the tree line. Land gets strange back there. We took it as typical rural eccentricity. We were so enamored with our new life we didn't think twice about it. The first oddity was the scarecrow. It stood in the exact center of Harlan's field, about 200 yards from our property line. It was a ragged, ancient thing, stuffed with straw and dressed in faded, rotting overalls and a plaid shirt. Its head was a burlap sack, its face crudely drawn with what looked like charcoal, 2 dark eyes and a stitched-on smile. It was held up by a rough-hewn wooden cross, tilting slightly to the left. It was creepy, sure, but it was just a scarecrow. We joked about it. We gave it a name, Jedediah. The strange thing about Jedediah was his position. Every morning, without fail, he would be facing our house. His charcoal eyes would be staring directly at our bedroom window. Every evening, when the sun set, he would be facing the woods. It was like clockwork. I mentioned it to Harlan one day when I saw him fixing a fence post. "That scarecrow of yours," I said, trying to sound casual. "Does it move?" Harlan stopped his work and looked at me, his eyes narrow. "Move?" "Yeah. It seems to face our house in the morning and the woods at night. Must be on some kind of swivel, right?" He held my gaze for a long moment, and I saw something unreadable in his eyes. Not confusion. Something else. Caution. "It's the wind," he said finally, turning back to his post. "Just the wind turning it. Nothing more." But his tone said otherwise. It was a dismissal, a warning to drop it. The feeling of peace we'd felt began to curdle. The silence started to feel less tranquil and more watchful. We began to notice other things. The animals. Our dog, a brave Labrador named Cooper, refused to go into the backyard after dusk. He'd stand at the door, whining, his tail between his legs. The local wildlife, the birds, the rabbits, seemed to give a wide berth to the tree line Harlan had warned us about. And then there were the sounds at night, not the normal sounds of the country. These were different. It started with a low, thrumming vibration that we felt more than heard, a resonance that made the windows in our house hum faintly. It would come from the direction of the woods, late at night, and it made the hair on our arms stand on end. One night, we heard something else, a high, piercing shriek that cut through the darkness. It wasn't a fox or a rabbit. It was something else, something that sounded both alien and agonized. It was followed by a profound silence, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The next morning, Sarah was pale. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I said. "Coyotes, maybe." We both knew it wasn't coyotes. The final straw of the build-up phase happened on a cold, foggy morning. The mist was so thick it swallowed the cornfield whole. I was drinking coffee on the porch when Cooper started barking furiously toward the field. The fog was so dense I could only see about 10 feet into the corn. And then, a figure emerged from the mist. It was Jedediah the Scarecrow. It was no longer in the center of the field. It was standing at the very edge of our property line, its burlap face just visible through the shifting fog. It was facing our house. Its arms, once limp, seemed to be stretched out just a little wider, as if in a mockery of an embrace. My blood went cold. It had moved, not turned, walked. I ran inside, grabbed my phone, and called Harlan. "The Scarecrow," I said, my voice shaking. "It's at the edge of my property. How did it get there?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Harlan's ragged breathing. "I'll take care of it," he said, his voice grim, and he hung up. 20 minutes later, I saw him through the fog, walking out into the field with a determined stride. He didn't look at our house. He went straight to the Scarecrow, grabbed it by its post, and with a grunt of effort, ripped it out of the ground. He threw the entire thing over his shoulder and carried it back toward his barn. I felt a wave of relief. It was over. Harlan had finally seen how creepy it was. But that evening, as the sun was setting, my relief vanished. Harlan came back out. He walked to the exact center of the field, carrying the Scarecrow. And he put it back. He pounded the post deep into the earth with a sledgehammer, his movements angry, frantic. He stood back, looked at it for a moment, then turned and looked directly at our house. He didn't wave. He just stared. Then he walked away. And the Scarecrow was facing the woods. Right on schedule. The message was clear. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't the wind. It was where it was supposed to be. And we were the problem. The next week, the harvest began. Harlan's massive combine chewed through the fields, reducing the towering wall of corn to a flat, stubbled wasteland. We were relieved. With the corn gone, there would be no place to hide. The Scarecrow would be taken down. The feeling of being watched would vanish. We were wrong. So terribly wrong. With the corn gone, the Scarecrow was more visible than ever. The lone, ragged sentinel in the middle of an empty field. And its position became even more bizarre. It no longer followed a pattern. Some mornings, it would be facing the road. Some evenings, it would be facing our house at midnight. It was as if, freed from its camouflage, it was becoming more brazen. The sounds from the woods grew louder, more frequent. The low thrumming was now a deep, subsonic drone that made our teeth ache. The shrieks were closer, sometimes accompanied by a frantic rustling in the undergrowth just beyond our tree line. One night, we lost power. The house plunged into a silence so absolute it was suffocating. The drone from the woods was the only sound, now louder than ever. We lit candles, our hands trembling. Cooper was going insane, barking and snarling at the back door, the fur on his back raised like a bristle brush. "I'm going to check the breaker box," I said, trying to sound brave. It was outside, on the side of the house facing the field. I opened the back door and stepped out into the oppressive darkness. The night was moonless, the stars blotted out by thick cloud. The only light came from my flickering flashlight. The drone was a physical pressure against my eardrums. I shone my light toward the breaker box and froze. The beam of my flashlight swept across the empty field and landed on the scarecrow. It was facing the house. But that wasn't all. It was closer. It was now at the halfway point between the center of the field and our property line. It had moved another 100 yards during the night. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't possible. It was just a bundle of straw on a stick. And then the drone from the woods stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. In that void of sound, I heard something else. A soft, dry, rustling sound, like straw rubbing against straw. It was coming from the scarecrow. I watched, my body frozen solid, as the scarecrow's head slowly, jerkily, turned. The burlap sack crinkled and strained. It wasn't turning toward me. It was turning toward the woods. It was looking at the woods. A moment later, an answer came from the tree line. A single, sharp crack, like a branch snapping. Then another. And another. It was a signal. A conversation. The scarecrow's arm, its straw-filled sleeve, began to move. It wasn't a fluid motion. It was a stiff, shuddering lift, as if powered by rusty gears. The arm rose, and its crude stick-finger hand pointed directly at our house. A wave of pure, undiluted terror washed over me. I stumbled backward, fumbled with the breaker box, and slammed the main switch. The lights in the house flickered on. I looked back at the field. The scarecrow was gone. The post was there, standing upright in the dirt. But the figure itself, the overalls, the shirt, the burlap head, it was gone, vanished. I sprinted back into the house, slamming and locking the door behind me. Sarah was white-faced. "What happened? What did you see?" I couldn't form the words. I just pointed a shaking finger toward the window. We both looked out at the empty field, and then we saw it. Something was moving in the field, not a person. It was a low, dark shape, scuttling on all fours with a horrible, skittering gait. It moved from the base of the scarecrow's post toward the woods, impossibly fast. It disappeared into the blackness of the tree line. A second later, the drone started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from directly above our house. A low, throbbing, metallic hum vibrated through the roof. The candles on our table flickered wildly. A high-pitched whine started in my ears, drowning out everything else. We clung to each other, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the roof to tear open. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence returned. The power stayed on. The drone was gone. We didn't sleep. We sat on the couch, holding each other, watching the windows until the sun came up. At first light, I forced myself to go outside. The world was still and peaceful. The field was empty. The scarecrow's post stood alone. I walked toward it, my heart pounding. When I reached the post, I saw them. Tracks. They started at the base of the post and led toward the woods. They weren't animal tracks. They weren't human tracks. They were deep, precise impressions in the hard earth, arranged in a strange, non-symmetrical pattern. They looked like the tracks of something that walked on multiple jointed legs. And lying in the dirt, right where the scarecrow had stood, was a single, long strip of faded, rotten plaid cloth. It was torn, as if ripped away in a struggle. It was from the Scarecrow's shirt. Harlan had been right. The Scarecrow wasn't there to scare the crows. It was there to scare something else, to keep something in the woods, contained. And we had disrupted it. Our presence, our skepticism, our cityness had broken some ancient, unspoken rule. The Scarecrow hadn't been a monster. It had been a guardian. And now it was gone. We packed our bags and left that same day. We didn't explain. We just went. We stayed in a motel 50 miles away and put the house on the market the next week. We sold it at a massive loss to a cash buyer who asked no questions. A year later, driven by a need for answers I knew I wouldn't get, I looked up the property on a satellite map. The new owners had clearly done work. The field where Harlan's corn had been was now a lush green pasture. But in the exact center, there was a new structure. It was a scarecrow, dressed in new, bright clothes. Its arms were outstretched, and it was facing the woods. Mr. Harlan had found a new tenant, someone who understood the rules. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed, if we'd tried to fight it. But I know the truth. You can't fight the land. You can't fight the old things that sleep in the soil and whisper from the trees. Some places have a balance, a rhythm that is older than humanity, a pact we don't understand. The Scarecrow wasn't the horror. The horror was what it was keeping watch against. The horror is what walks in the deep woods when the guardian turns its back. The horror is knowing that in the great, silent emptiness of the country, we are not the top of the food chain. We are just temporary visitors. And if we're not careful, if we don't respect the silence and the secrets it holds, the things that live in the dark edges of the world will come to collect the rent